For my announcements. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to our guest speaker, Patrick Cunningham. We're really excited to have him join us and really grateful for the time that he spent to create this presentation and also the workbook that he shared with all of us as a resource as well. So Patrick, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and turn things over to you. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you very much, Lindy. It sounds like y'all have some really neat things going on. I've seen some of those topics. It'd be fun to join you. And I am jealous of you getting to be on spring break next week. We're on a quarter system here at Rose-Hulman, and we're at a quarter break, and I've had to move offices because of construction. So it hasn't been as restful as some other breaks. But I'm happy to be here with you today. Let me get my screen shared here. Right, so you should be able to see that, hopefully. And I'll get myself into presentation mode. Is everybody still able to see everything? Okay,
yeah,
terrific. All right, and understand Kristen's going to help monitor the chat as we go through things. At any time, please feel free to post a question or a comment in there. Between Kristen and I, we'll be able to make sure we address them. If you'd like to talk, I'd like to ask you to raise your Zoom hands, and Kristen can kind of moderate if you have a question you'd like to ask verbally, or if you have a comment you want to share. So I welcome the interaction and the conversation as we go. It's a privilege to be with you today. I've been teaching for a little while now. I've been at Rose-Hulman for 15 years, and I teach being a smaller undergraduate teaching focused institution. I teach across our mechanical engineering curriculum from freshmen to seniors. And I found myself gravitating more to lab-based, project-based courses, or if it doesn't have that I add some of those authentic experiences in. And part of that really comes from my interest in metacognition. And I like to say I like to help students make their knowledge useful to them. And I like to help them to become better learners, and metacognition helps do that. Hence the term helping students to use a learning lever, as I see metacognition as a tool to help amplify their learning and something they can do on their own. And not just in my class, but for a longer term benefit. I do want to comment on the workbook that I provided. It'd be really handy to have it at least open, if not also possibly printed out. You might want to have some paper handy. I at least have one thing I'd like you to either type or write down partway through here. And I'll make references to specific pages in the workbook as we go, so you kind of know how the slides and the workbook will go together. All right. All righty. So I actually have a question for you all first. Let's see if, there we go. What are you expecting from our time together? If you could put a comments in the chat area. I'm curious, based on the introduction, based on the title, what is it you're looking for? Okay. Terrific. So ways to help students in their learning, helping students to achieve learning objectives. Great. Helping students to be more mindful, or I might take that to be intentional in the learning process. So I think we can achieve those goals. As we go, if you have some as they come up, I'd love to see those as well. Insight on metacognition. Jennifer, I appreciate the comment. That actually will be tailored into one of the things we'll focus on today, is helping students to be better at self-assessing. And so that'll be some stuff that we talk about. And yes, yes. So hopefully we can address these things. I think the material we have will definitely be able to explore some of this and how to support our students better. Okay. And metacognition is definitely a reflective process, and helping as you reflect on it to help improve your learning. So with that, appreciate the feedback. Let's dive in here. I guess I got to get clicked on the right thing here. I first want to acknowledge my colleagues that I do this work with. We call ourselves the Skillful Learning Team. It really came out of a grant that we received starting back in 2014. And that was originally, I did a sabbatical at Virginia Tech, and that's where I got to know Dr. Hale Manasovich. And she focuses on motivation. I focus on metacognition, and we really think both of those things permeate a lot of what we do in the classroom. Dr. Rachel Ellisted and Dr. Cheryl Carrico are actually former PhD students with Dr. Matasovich, and they've gone on in different places. And we still work together doing the metacognition research work, giving workshops and various things around that. So I want to acknowledge their input and their contributions here as well. Official recognition of NSF funding here. And you can see our institutions there. And actually, Dr. Carrico actually is an independent contractor, so she has her own business. With that, let's do a little exploration. I'm going to try to keep this a little bit brief, but I welcome your questions as I go through this. Let's try to bring some definition to what metacognition is. I think oftentimes at a very high level, it's referred to as thinking about thinking, which is a good start, but there's a lot more detail to it. And in fact, there's a publication that has a full broad taxonomy, and there are many dimensions to that. But the things that we have found people most agree on is that there are two main constructs within metacognition. That's the knowledge of cognition and the regulation of our thinking processes, or cognition. And each of those is made up of some subcomponents. And the ones that we've included here actually are the ones that are most commonly agreed upon, and you'll see referred to somewhat regularly. The cyclical nature with the arrows is intentional in that it's not a hierarchical thing. It's not a sequential thing. It's kind of, these things are happening along the way. Your knowledge of cognition really informs how you regulate your thinking processes. As you have those experiences of regulating and experiencing learning and thinking, that will hopefully update how you understand how you process information, or what tasks are require of you, and things like that. So these are really interconnected and kind of operate synergistically, but it's helpful to separate them out to be able to talk about them. So let's quickly go through some of these. Knowledge of persons really speaks to knowledge of how you yourself process information, but also how we process information in general. It can be understanding that we actually don't multitask. We are fast task switchers. We have the appearance of multitasking, for example, when one thing is relatively automatic or very automatic, and the other thing might require more. But when two things are cognitively demanding, we just can't do it. All right, so that would be an example of knowledge of persons or processing, or the knowledge of that having spaced practice or distributed practice over multiple days and shorter sessions is better than one long mass practice for longer term memory and retention. Those are examples there. Or maybe I'd like to talk about learning preferences as opposed to styles, as learning styles have largely been debunked, and at least in terms of receiving instruction in a preferred learning style does not correlate to better learning, for example. So those are all things that fit in with this category. And So when with learning preferences, we might have a preference, but the recognition that getting into multiple modes of representation, which we'll talk about later today, is beneficial. Knowledge of tasks can be recognition of a math problem set is different than an engineering statics problem, open-ended problem, which is different than writing an essay for a literature class or writing a lab report's different than that, and the different cognitive demands of those tasks. So that's what that refers to. Knowledge of strategies, which we will be focusing somewhat on, is knowing what strategies are, how they function, and what they're appropriate for. So there's some interplay between this task knowledge and strategy knowledge, that some strategies are more applicable to some tasks than others. Okay, and some strategies are more effective at building longer term understanding than others, and build more are more efficient in their effectiveness. Okay, moving to the regulation side, where it involves planning, monitoring, and controlling, monitoring, controlling, and evaluating our understanding. This is more that during the experience, after the experience, the active role that we play in our awareness. Planning, it's more than just logistics, although there can be some logistical things, such as choosing a quiet space versus a noisy, distracting space, turning TV and other distractions off. That could be metacognitively motivated. But it's starting to think about the alignment of the strategies and the tasks, having a clear learning goal, not just a, hey, I want to get this assignment finished, but what is it I want to get out of this from a learning standpoint? So selecting the strategies based on the tasks, recognizing kind of how you understand things and the type of understanding you want to come out of this session with, what your objective is. So that's what we mean by aspects of metacognitive planning. I put monitoring and controlling together because these things are during the process of executing the learning tasks. Monitoring can be recognizing that you're stuck, recognizing that you have a gap in your understanding. Someone had mentioned the recognizing what you don't know. Monitoring is part of that process of coming to that recognition. Or recognizing that, hey, I've been doing this for 20 minutes and I've been stuck the last 10. All right. Those are sorts of awarenesses that we might have. The controlling aspect is then in response to what you recognize is happening, what actions are you taking to do that? It can be kind of a stop, start, continue thing. Okay, this isn't working. I need to stop and do something else. I need to start doing something else, or this isn't working, or excuse me, let's see, we said isn't working. If it is working, let's keep doing it. Let's continue, right? So it doesn't have to have a negative connotation. Not everything needs refined. Some of us, as we naturally go in, some practices are good, some need refinement. So those two things I see going together, and those are during the process of executing the task. And really the main difference between monitoring and evaluating is this temporal aspect. The monitoring and evaluating, similar in types of the questions or recognitions, but the evaluating usually happens after the thing. And this could be anything from after the assignment, after an exam, after a class period. It could be at the end of a semester or a term. It depends on the scope that you're evaluating. Okay, but you're wanting to know what worked, what didn't work. I thought I was trying to get this understanding. I achieved, I didn't achieve. And the outputs of this monitoring and evaluation actually are part of what feeds back into that revision and refinement of your knowledge of cognition, your knowledge of tasks, knowledge of strategies, and really your knowledge of your own processing and how people process information. So that really is the model of metacognition as we've understood it and as we've defined it. And these we've tried to pull from the most commonly agreed upon components, though I think our representation in this kind of cyclical intertwined presentation is a little bit unique. But I wonder if there are any questions or comments here. I'll look in the chat to see. Okay. don't see anything coming through. So if we do, we can stop. Okay, I see one. I'm curious how these things work with ADHD. Unfortunately, I'm not very well versed in that aspect of things. I do know here at Rose-Hulman, we have someone who works with the student support services who would be more well versed. She talks a lot about executive function and trying to support our students in agency. So I'm sorry that I'm not as able to speak to that in particular, but that does have an impact, and our ability to focus and pay attention in a learning process does make a big difference. So, all right. All right, if there's another question that pops through, we'll stop and handle that as it comes. All right, so next, I'd like to look at why I think we should teach metacognition. And there are kind of three main themes here that I've come to. And actually, before I jump into those, I often say that we always teach something about how the learning process works, even if we don't intentionally say anything about it. The structure of the class, the how we talk about assignments, how we talk about what they need to do to be successful, even if we don't intentionally teach about or think about what we're saying about how learning works, we say something. And so for me, teaching about metacognition is in part about making intentional choices about what I'm telling students about how the learning process works, and trying to be accurate about that and help them to be more successful. So one of the first things here is it's reflected in our title for today's talk, that metacognition amplifies learning. It helps us to reflect on the learning processes and assess how it's going, and to refine those processes and try to get better at it. I'll give you a moment there. The quote that I put on there is actually from a recent blog post that I put up on, I contributed to the Improve with Metacognition website. It's listed in our resources. I might point to it in a little bit. But I've also seen this same sentiment in other places, so it's not just my own unique thing. But if I'm able to teach students how they can be more aware and more involved, have more agency in their learning process, I can help them amplify what they do in the class meetings that we have, but also outside of class, and hopefully in other classes and in their future. So in those ways, I think of it as an amplifier or a lever in learning. Another aspect is that metacognition has the capacity to lift all students' experience, struggling students, high achieving students. If I'm thinking of high achieving students, I'm thinking of students who often carry a lot of stress and are trying to work and get good grades and they might not recognize that they're overworking at times and that they could be more efficient. Perhaps many of us fall into this category as people who become educators. I know I was one of these. I think I had a memorable experience around my junior or senior year in a second level thermodynamics course, where I went and hung out with friends and watched a movie the night before the final exam. And I went and took the final and did perfectly fine. And up to that point, I'd just been studying and studying on any of my courses. And I could have been more efficient with what I was doing, and I could have been more relaxed perhaps through the process. It also helps students to recognize that they can make a difference in their learning. It's not just because I have this professor or that professor, or I didn't get this professor that I wanted, but you can learn in whatever circumstance you are in. So there's a sense of empowerment, of agency, and even the building of confidence. The Nielsen and Dimbo and Selly references that I put down at the bottom, and again, the more full references is at the back of your workbook. And I should note here, I've started going, I told you I'd tell you where we are in the pages. in the workbook, and and actually this section is not, there are no pages in the workbook for this material. The first bit of definition of metacognition was on page 2. So we're between page 2 and 3 right now. Sorry about that. But Nielsen and Dimbo and Selly focus on self-regulation, self-regulated learning, and consider that a larger construct of which a major component is metacognition, and helping with the reflection on how we're processing the information and making choices about that. But self-regulation also includes monitoring and regulating, say, emotions, environment, and other factors as well. Another aspect that metacognition lifts students, all students, has to do with equity. Of all the students that come into us, they all come with different preparations, different experiences, some of them more well-prepared and independent already, and many for factors outside of their own control, not having built some of those, that independence or some of the learning habits. Perhaps they didn't have those models growing up. And so Sandra McGuire, who wrote this, she's an emeritus teaching and learning center director at Louisiana State University, I think was her last position. She also taught chemistry at Cornell University. And so this is a recent article that she wrote talking about how teaching metacognition can help lift all learners and help support those who haven't had the background. And so that's an important aspect, I believe, as well. And then really teaching metacognition has, and I've mentioned this a little bit, has an immediate benefit with the present context, but has an enduring impact in their future down the road. That sense of empowerment that I can make choices and evaluate what's happening, and I can make different choices and improve the outcomes. There's also an aspect, as I think of professional practice, which is why I gravitate towards more authentic projects in my engineering courses, is real engineering is messy, and they're open-ended and ill-structured. There are multiple paths to a solution. There are multiple acceptable solutions. There are also many bad solutions, but navigating that space, recognizing when you don't have knowledge and you need to find knowledge, and how to go about finding that knowledge or getting that knowledge is important. And so being able to navigate the professional practice of problem solving involves metacognition. And that's actually the reason for the Jonathan reference down there on learning to solve problems, as he makes that connection of the role of metacognition and solving open-ended, ill-structured problems. I also have a quote from Terry Doyle and Todd Zakreisik from The New Science of Learning. This is actually the first edition. I think they have a second edition, but they make a bold claim at the beginning of the book that becoming a skilled and efficient learner will be one of the most important determinants of what you can and will achieve in your lifetime. And I've come to believe that. And so wanting to lift my students up to help them to be able to achieve more by helping them to navigate their present and their future. So those are a few reflections on why I think we ought to be teaching. We teach something about learning, whether we intend to or not. And it's, I think, important that we make intentional choices about what we communicate to our students about the learning process so that they can be more successful now and in their futures. So before we go on there, let me pause briefly and let's see. Whoops, sorry about that. I saw somebody shared a link. I wanted to try to see what that was. I think I may have seen that same article. There we go. See if there are any other comments here. Okay. All right. So by that, I will say that you all assent with me, right? All right. So now to some practical aspects. How can we teach it? So it sounds great. Sounds like it can do a lot of things. I will say that teaching metacognition there's not a silver bullet within our teaching and learning. we cannot make our students do or think or behave. We can entice them, we can try to help them. And so in the teaching, I want to reach as many students as possible, and I want to consistently communicate accurate information about the learning process. And I do think that we can teach and incentivize the development of metacognition in our students. So first thing I would recommend has to do with helping our students to even agree that it's necessary, that becoming a more skillful learner is a useful thing. Many of our students are coming to us. They have, well, our students come to us, they have their K-12 experience, some students even more. And they've done a lot of learning over those years, and they've developed habits and practices of how they approach learning, how they think about learning. So these are deeply ingrained habits, but not all of them are necessarily useful. And so as you're talking to students about the need to engage in metacognitive development or growth, or to become more skillful learners, they may or may not see its utility unless we try to help them. I have a picture of a horse eating there. There's a saying you may have heard that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. That may well be true, but my grandfather also asserted that you could put salt in the oats. And so I try to think about how can I make my teaching salty to help entice my students into learning and growing. And so there are a couple of things here, and this is a good place to point over to our workbook. We're on pages 3 and 4, where I put a little more detail along with these short descriptors. So there's a little more detail there on page 3 and the top of page 4. The ones here on the slide with asterisks are the ones I'm going to spend a little bit more time about, but if you ask questions and we have time, I'd be happy to explore the others in more detail. I at least will briefly touch on them. The what does it mean to learn something? This is something I often use at the beginning of a class to try to start to get students to think about just what we're doing here. And they often get to some very good operational definitions of learning, being able to explain or apply. And then it allows us to connect some of the activities we do in the class to those objectives. So it's kind of, if you will, a norming conversation. I'll skip over the asterisk here briefly. How did you know you knew what you knew? That's intentionally kind of a mouthful. But have you ever had a student come to you after an exam? I really knew the material, I just couldn't show you on the exam. And I used to kind of wring my hands and really try to go over things. I still have empathy for my students, but my responses have changed since I've studied metacognition. I say, that's interesting. I said, well, how did you know you knew? And then that starts a conversation. They said, well, I reread my notes, or I went over my notes. I said, well, what does that mean? Well, you know, I kind of looked at example problems and I kind of looked at some definitions or things. Like, okay, so how did you know that meant that you could actually do that on a problem yourself? And eventually we get to, and I think I have a reference to this, is what Marilla Sivnicki calls the illusion of comprehension. And I think it's even more powerful if you help the student to discover it on their own. And I say, oh, we have a name for that. It's where you confuse your familiarity with understanding. And so would you like to hear about some ways that you could avoid that? All right. So that's what that has to do with. And then the last one, really, how to do connecting preparations and performance on assessments or exams and making plans for the future. That really centers around exam wrapper, which several of you might be familiar with already. So those are just some very brief touches there. But I'd like to take a step back now to the asterisk items. Is your knowledge useful to you? All right, so this is the second one on page 3, where it says, give students an authentic engineering task. And For me, this happens in a senior project level course that I teach, where the whole term it's just a project and they're having to navigate the space. And it leverages a prior course and actually a multitude of other courses in the curriculum that they have to draw on to be able to solve these or work through these projects to an acceptable solution. And as they're starting to work with this and they're starting to recognize things that they need, and then they start to recognize that there are gaps in their knowledge or they don't know it as well as they thought they knew it. And in fact, this past term, this past winter, as we were going through some of this process, it led to an impromptu conversation about our information processing system, how we take information into our working memory, how things get encoded into our long-term memory, which was really exciting that the student recognized that this was a challenge, but through this authentic task where they had to draw on it, but they recognize the insufficiency of that. So that's really what that is. That would take some careful parameters around it. And it's not meant to put students down as much as to help build awareness. Right. And so you'd want to be very supportive in that environment and help them to process through and see the connections. In fact, I think that could make it a more constructive and more powerful experience. So, but it's really wanting them to also see that there are also some of the aspects that might have come easily to them that they know really well. And so you could also ask them to differentiate, well, what was your engagement with these different topics that we had to use? Because you did really well with this, but this seems really fuzzy. And so you could help them to draw those connections to their prior engagement, their prior knowledge of a topic. They may have encountered it in high school or in a co-op or an internship or something, as well as in a class. And so it reinforced it even more, as opposed to I was just trying to get a grade in that class and just get through it. Right. And so helping them to recognize that. Are there any comments or questions? Okay. Whoops, I'm accidentally going forward here. All right, then the next one here, it's the third on the list on page 3. This is what I call, what are you good at? Or having students identify something they're good at and then start to reflect on that. I've actually used this through some metacognitive modules that I've developed with students. And I asked them, okay, it could be anything. It could be a sport, it could be a hobby, it could be music, it could be a course or a subject that you're interested in, anything that you consider yourself good at. And wanting to ask them then, how did you get good at it? How many different ways have you engaged with this topic or this activity? Over what time frame did you develop these skills? Overall, how long did it take before you considered yourself really good at this? Right. And then having them do that, I actually had it on page on the front side. Then you flip the page and it says, okay, how does that experience connect with becoming proficient with the material in this class or becoming a practicing engineer? And that sort of that expectation, that desire, you're wanting to be good at what you're going to do, right? And kind of assuming they actually want to do well in the class and asking them, how does this connect? Again, you can't reach all students. When I did this, I had one student tell me how great they were at soccer, which is fun. But then when they flipped the page, they said, and it doesn't have anything to do with this class. All right, that told me where that individual was. It was one out of about 30, but there are always going to be a couple of those, but you're trying to reach as many as possible. But there are many who were very thoughtful in their response to, oh, hey, this is going to take effort. It's going to take different ways of engaging with material. And it's going to take time and repeated routine practice to do this. So trying to elicit kind of those analogies that can be useful, that are common to their experience. Okay. Are there other questions? Comments? Okay, then we'll move on then. Okay, I'm going to ask you to do something here. We're actually getting ready to get on to page below the line on page 4, but we're not quite there. So this is a little bit of a transition. But you might want to have either a blank document open where you can type in, or a blank piece of paper and something to write with. All right. Within Dimbo and Selly's book, they talk about one categorization of learning strategies that I found particularly helpful: rehearsal, elaboration, and organization. Rehearsal, you can think of rote memory. With engineering problem solving, I call that pattern matching, where if I just work enough problems, you can't give me one I haven't seen before, right? That's at the rehearsal level. That being said, we do need to know stuff at that level. We do need to have things committed to memory. So I do not advocate that we get rid of rehearsal. We do need some rehearsal. However, we also need elaboration and organization. Elaboration has to do with building more connections and tendrils off of a piece of knowledge. And you can see that depicted here in this graphic. In fact, I talk about the rehearsal, and I actually use my hands to do it visually. Rehearsal helps make a stronger road or path straight to that piece of information, but it's only a single path. So if you need it and you only have it memorized, you have to activate that one path. All right. With elaboration, as you build connections and more meat around it and you integrate it with your knowledge framework, you now have these multiple paths to that same piece of information. And it makes it more accessible and more likely that you're going to activate it when you need it. When you're doing that authentic engineering project, and you say, hey, I remember we did this over here and we used it this way. Maybe we could apply that here. That would be an example of being able to activate it because you have it connected in different ways. And then I think even Dimbo and Selly speak of organization as possibly a subset of elaboration, but organization has to do with kind of categorizing or showing connections between things, or the arrangements between things. So if you think of, say, an engineering dynamics course, and you think of the relative motion and some of the different aspects, you can set up a framework of how this connects to this connects, and you can get to from very simple particle motion all the way to general plane motion in some successive steps, and seeing how that changes. But that organization can help us remember and use information as well. And it kind of sometimes, even as I talk about metacognition, you see I have that cyclical model that's so ingrained in my mind. When I talk about metacognition, I see that picture in my mind, and I'm using that to help navigate. So it's an organizational structure that has helped me. All right. So are we ready for the task?
Excuse me, I have a question.
Oh, sure.
So I think your elaboration is often referred to as using prior knowledge. Would you agree with that?
It in part. It is a component of elaboration. It's you could consider it as you're trying to integrate new knowledge in with the old knowledge. So in that sense, or another aspect would be building analogies, which you can't build an analogy with something you don't already know. So it would be using something familiar with you to help you try to explain something that's unfamiliar, would be leveraging prior knowledge as well.
Okay, thanks.
Does that make sense?
Yes, very much so.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to give you approximately 15 seconds to remember some items on a list. Okay. And I'm going to then go to another slide, and we'll see how much we remember. Okay. So, oops, I already gave, I got ahead of myself. Do we have an idea of which category is most common among our students?
Rehearsal, perhaps?
Definitely. In my own classes that are more fundamental courses, I have students commonly asking, can you just work more problems? We need to work more problems. You don't work enough problems. Can you give me more practice problems? Do we have practice tests? Those have a place, but the predominant dependence on those as a mode of engagement hamstrings our ability to work on more authentic engineering problems. So I advocate for some rehearsal, but then moving more elaborative and organizational. So, okay, now we're ready for the task. All right, I'm going to give you about 15 seconds here. All right, study the list. Okay, that's about 15 seconds. Now, if you would, take your paper or your open electronic document and type as many of those things as you can. Okay. How are we doing? You just type a number in the chat so we can start to see. Okay. Wow, some of you are really good. Hopefully you weren't cheating and starting to write before we left. Okay, terrific. All right. Now let's repeat the activity, but with a little bit different, a little difference in the organization, as I've indicated by the graphic here. All right. So again, in about 15 seconds for studying the list. Okay, that was about 15 seconds. Now try to recall as many as you can. Very good, Marnie. Yes. You were already organizing. That's terrific. Ooh, I saw another strategy there, making up a story with the words in the list. That's a really good idea, Jennifer. Yep. I'm unfamiliar with Memory Palace. Someone might have to illuminate me.
Yeah, it's a technique for memorizing things in the sense that where you're familiar with something, such as your home, you can probably close your eyes and envision your home as you walk in around your house, and you take the items in a list that you need to memorize, and you visualize those being in a specific spot in your home, and you place them around.
Okay.
Make some sort of meaning behind them, and then you can close your eyes and then walk through your home and find where those items are. And it's a good way to memorize. You can sit down and memorize like a list of 20 things in a couple of minutes and then recall it with 100% accuracy.
Wow, terrific, terrific. So you guys are a primed audience here. So how did we do this time on the recall? Some of you already had some good strategies in place to help do this. But those that weren't already using some of those strategies, okay, getting a few more. Yes. Okay. So so here it's a little bit of an illustration, just that aspect of organizing, or as we've heard, with starting to connect the pieces of information with other things that are meaningful to us, going through our home or creating a story with it, that sense of organizing and connecting helps us to remember better, and be able to ultimately use the information, or at least access it, so that we have the chance to use it. All right, so just meant as a demonstration of the strategies we use matter. But it sounds like you're already somewhat well-versed in that area. So what I'd like to do now is a little bit of choose your own adventure. So as we get into pages 5, 6, 7, and 8, there are a whole lot of different examples of things we can do, right? As I mentioned, I see that students from our work predominantly work with rehearsal strategies and very much are highly dependent on it and even at times resistant to trying new things. And so one of the things I've sought to do in my teaching is to engage students in different ways with the material in my classroom and help them to both learn about different strategies and ways to engage and their benefits, but then actually do it. I actually first did some these metacognition modules that I created in a colleague's class that was taught rather traditionally, with doing example problems in class, having traditional tests where they worked similar looking problems. And I tried to work with them, and they weren't as engaged in wanting to try new strategies. Later, I taught the same course, and I brought in these several different ways of engaging with the material. And students were more receptive to learning about new strategies within the context where I actually modeled it in the class. And we actually, and so they got to experience it and get more familiar with it. We tend to trust what's familiar and comfortable. So again, these are ingrained habits that they've built over time and had some success with. So trying to get students to try something else is understandably challenging. And so wanting to help build their strategy toolbox, if you will. So let's see here. So let's first look here. I think, Kristen, we're ready for the first poll.
Sure. There's a question in the chat about, do you think that this preference of students for rehearsal may be connected to any preference of teachers for this strategy?
That's a good question. So I have to make some assumption of what you mean by teacher preference for the strategy. And I'll take that as perhaps the way the assessments are set up, that rehearsal helps you get good grades on the assessment, whether you have the understanding or not. I actually have a PhD student in my colleague's research group who studies the use of assessments. And there's an overwhelming reliance on certain types of problem solving exams in fundamental engineering classes. And you honestly can pattern match and memorize your way through those without having really gotten the learning outcomes. So in that sense, I definitely think there is a connection, because our students actually come to us with some level of metacognitive activity, and they are strategic. And so if they can get through without, they will take an easier path, because honestly, some of these things that we talk about are effortful and require effort. And yes, students do kind of work to the tests or assessments. They work to what we measure. And so that can be a very powerful thing. So again, that's perhaps why I like authentic engineering projects, where we start to write reports and we do presentations, and there are different ways and we have lots of formative interactions. One of my favorite questions is, how do you know that? And well, we think somebody else did this. So I think, well, but how do you know if that applies here? Well, I say, well, how can you find out if this applies here or if that's useful to you? And then we have a different conversation. They come up with some ideas and they can fill that in. So yes, does that answer your question, Marcus?
Thumbs up, he says.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. So now I think we're ready for the first poll. How much time do we have here yet?
Yeah, we have just a few more minutes, but then we'll leave this open as we typically do for optional discussion for the next 30 minutes to whoever who can stick around. So I'll launch that.
Okay. So the first poll is looking at the first 6 items there. which would you like to talk about? You can vote twice. Okay. Ooh, it's kind of close. Alrighty. Maybe we can call it now. We have almost everybody has responded. It looks like graphical representations have just slightly edged out interleave practice and creating analogies. Oh, actually, there got to be some rather even things there. All right, let's talk briefly about graphical representations. And there we go. This top of page 6. All right. And you might be familiar. There are two terms that I commonly hear along these lines. One is concept maps, one is mind maps. I kind of have a personal preference towards concept maps, but that doesn't mean students do. But concept maps, both of these are getting at trying to have nodes of information and showing connections between them. So let's start there. And part of why or how this works has to do with the fact that we can think about our knowledge as a framework in our minds, and really it's patterns of synapses firing. But differences between novices and experts have to do with you have a sparsely populated, not very well integrated set of pieces of information in novices, and experts have highly populated, highly interconnected frameworks of knowledge. And so using such graphical methods of having students to populate with nodes of information and discerning connections between them is in some sense trying to help them to, outside of themselves, represent something that's actually in their minds and trying to help instigate some of its development. And so that's one possibility there.